Good afternoon, everyone. We've got a lot of people still coming in, and we'd like to welcome you to this Thursday afternoon session. It's great to have so many of you in the room already. Thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce our very auspicious guest this afternoon, Dr. Simphiwe Mayisela, the CEO of SS Consulting. Dr. Mayisela has a long relationship with TANCS, and I'm going to just read his biography to you. And he's going to be presenting this afternoon on the MITRE attack framework, which is a cornerstone of cybersecurity practice. Dr. Mayisela is a cybersecurity professional, and he focuses on governance, risk, and compliance within the cybersecurity domain. He was instrumental in establishing the inaugural South African chapter for the International Information System Security Certification Consortium, ISC2. He's the pioneer and president of this chapter, and he currently is the Chief Executive Officer of SS Consulting. He's a beacon of integrity and has received the esteemed Outer Moral Courage Recognition Certificate in 2024. Which was for supporting the South African Police Service's crackdown on corruption issues in the Public Investment Corporation. He has over 21 years of experience in the cybersecurity domain, where he worked in government, gaming and hospitality, banking and telecoms. He holds a CISP certification, a CISM certification, ISO 27001 lead implementer, and Sherwood Applied Business Security Architect. Furthermore, he holds a master's degree in information security from Rhodes University and is a Doctor of Business Leadership from the UNISA Graduate School of Business Leadership. Dr. Mayisela, with this very auspicious curriculum vitae, we welcome you. We thank you for your ongoing support of TANCS, including in the TANCS Cyber Talent Accelerator. And we're very much looking forward to what you've got to say today. And with that, I'll hand you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Noel. Thanks for the lovely introduction. So good afternoon, students. So today we're going to be covering a MITRE attack framework, which has to do with cyber threat intelligence. So as per the agenda, we're going to start by knowing your enemy, know thy enemy, and we're going to talk about adversary-inspired testing versus traditional security assessment, and touch about briefly on types of security assessments as well as adversary emulation. And then we're going to do some practical demo on how the MITRE attack framework works. I'm going to do a demo on the MITRE attack matrix and also on the navigating layer or the MITRE attack navigation platform. And yeah, so the session is going to be both theory and practice. So in terms of introduction, so I'm just going to give you a brief theory in terms of what the MITRE attack framework is all about. So in terms of backgrounds, today we are going to explore one of the most important frameworks called the MITRE attack framework. But before we get into the framework itself, let's start with the simple reality about how cyber threats have evolved. So back in the days, many security systems relied on what you call signature-based detection. This means they detected threats by recognizing patterns from attacks that they've already been seen. Much like antivirus software, it used to identify known malware. So while this approach has been useful, it has a major limitation. It struggles to detect new, unknown, and more sophisticated attacks. And here's where the problem becomes serious. So studies have shown that once an organization is breached, attackers often remain inside the network for about weeks or months. This is called a dwell time. For instance, the recent IBM report shows that attackers remain undetected for about 204 to 207 days on average. So during that time, they are not idle. They are exploring, moving laterally, and exploring systems. So this raises some critical questions. How did they get in? How are they moving around inside the network? What exactly are they doing? And more importantly, where do we even start in trying to stop them? So to answer these questions, the cybersecurity community has shifted towards a more advanced approach known as threat-informed defense, or sometimes called adversary-inspired defense. So instead of only focusing on vulnerabilities or tools, this approach focuses on understanding the behavior of attackers themselves. Specifically, it looks at their tactics, or also known as their goals. It looks at the techniques, which means how they achieve these goals. And also it looks at their procedures in terms of how they execute their attacks in practice. So this is where the MITRE attack framework comes in. The MITRE attack is essentially a knowledge base of real-world attacker behavior. It organizes how attackers operate into a structured model that helps us understand every stage of an attack, from initial access to all the way to data exfiltration. So within each tactic, there are multiple techniques because attackers don't all operate the same way. So they adapt based on their skills, their tool sets available to them, as well as the environment that they are targeting. So for each technique, the attack framework provides a description of how the attack works, the systems or platforms it affects, also the examples of how it has been used in real-world attacks, and importantly, ways to detect and mitigate that. So different attack groups may use different techniques, but the framework allows us to map and understand these patterns in a consistent way. So what does this mean for a cybersecurity professional? It means we move from reacting to attacks to anticipating them. So by understanding how attackers think and operate, we can detect suspicious behavior earlier, we can strengthen our defenses in the right places, and we can also respond more effectively when incidents occur. So in simple terms, the MITRE attack framework helps us answer those questions I've laid out earlier in terms of how the attackers get in, how they move in, and what they do once they're inside. And more importantly, it helps us to stop them. So as we go through this lecture, we'll break down the structure of the framework, explore key tactics and also the techniques, and see how it can be applied in a real-world security operations. So let's begin by defining the MITRE attack framework itself. So the word attack, as you see there on screen, ATT&CK. So A stands for adversarial, T stands for tactics, the other T stands for techniques, and common knowledge. That's what the CK stands for. So it's a framework developed and maintained by the MITRE Corporation. And you can think of it as a comprehensive structured database of how cyber attackers behave in the real world. So rather than focusing on specific malware or vulnerabilities, the framework focuses on what attackers actually do, their actions, their decisions, movements within compromised environments, and so forth. So this is a key shift from how we know traditional security models. So instead of asking what virus is this or which vulnerability is being exploited, the framework asks what is the attacker trying to achieve, how are they doing it, and what steps are they taking along the way. So the framework organizes this knowledge into what we call TTPs. T stands for tactics, the other T stands for techniques, and P stands for procedures. So tactics are the attacker's goals or what they want to achieve, and techniques is how these goals can be achieved. And the procedures are the specific implementations used in the real attack. So now let's make this more practical. The framework maps out the full journey of an attack. It shows how attackers gain initial access into the network, how they move laterally across systems, how they escalate privileges to gain more control, and ultimately how they evade defense or bypass security controls while they work towards achieving their objectives. So importantly, the framework looks at all of these from analyzes these behaviors into tactics, which represent the high-level technical objectives. For example, there's a technique called defense evasions, also known as avoiding detection. There's other techniques called lateral movement. Lateral movements means how the attackers spread across the systems. And also there are techniques called exfiltrations. Exfiltration means how the attackers steal data or take out data from systems once they've compromised them. So within each tactic, there are multiple techniques. So each technique represents specific methods an attacker might use to achieve that objective. So for instance, if the goal is the lateral movement, there isn't just one way to do lateral movement, if you come to think of it. So attackers may use different techniques depending on their skills, tool sets, and their environment they are in. So in a nutshell, the framework gives us a structured way to understand the attacker behavior step by step, from entry to impact, from the cradle to the grave. So it helps us move beyond thinking about isolated threats and instead focus on the full attack life cycle. So with that, and that understanding allows us to detect, defend, and also respond much more effectively. So this slide talks about knowing thy enemy or knowing the attacker. So what I've depicted there is what you call the Bianco's pyramid of pain. So now that we understand how the framework itself works, we need to focus on how the attackers behave themselves so that we can be able to effectively defend against them. So in the cybersecurity landscape, not all attackers are the same. So on one side, you have what we might call traditional stereotypical hackers or strip kiddies. These are often motivated by financial gain, and their attacks tend to be more opportunistic. So they follow what we call a hit and run approach. They break in, take what they need, and leave. So on the other side, you find more advanced persistent threats, also known as APTs. These ones are more sophisticated, they are highly organized, they are very well resourced, well financed in some cases, and also driven by a specific long-term objective, such as stealing intellectual property or state secrets. So unlike traditional hackers, APTs are patient. They plan, they adapt, and are also persistent within a network over time. But here's an important point. Even less sophisticated attackers can still pose a serious threat because they often reuse tools and techniques developed by APTs. So the gap between advanced and simple hackers is starting to diminish. So now this brings us to a crucial shift in defensive thinking. Back then, organizations used to focus on what you call IOCs or indicators of compromise. These are things like malicious IP addresses, file hashes, and non-domain names. But here's the problem. These IOCs or indicators of compromise are easy for attackers to change. So instead of just chasing indicators, we need to focus on something more powerful. And what's that? Attackers' behavior. This is where the concept of pyramid of pain, which was introduced by David Bianco, becomes very important. So the idea is simple. The higher up the pyramid you go, the more difficult and costly it becomes for the attacker to adapt. So let me walk through this pyramid from the bottom to the top. So at the bottom, we've got hash values. These are very easy for attackers to change. Just modifying a simple bit in malware can produce a completely different hash. So blocking hashes causes very little pain to the attacker. So that's why it's sitting at the bottom of the pyramid there. Let's walk through it from next up. We've got IP addresses. Attackers can rotate IPs. They can use botnets. They can use anonymous tools like the Tor. I'm not sure if you also know the Tor, the onion ring that hides your IP address and then what hackers use to communicate on the dark web. So this makes this layer also relatively easy to bypass. Then we move to the next layer called the domain names. These are slightly harder to replace, but still relatively accessible, especially with anonymous registrations and cryptocurrency payments. Above that, you've got the network and host artifacts. So these include things like unusual traffic patterns or identifiable behaviors in logs. So at this level, we start to slow attackers down, forcing them to adjust their tools or methods. The next layer, we find the tools. So if you can detect and block specific tools attackers rely on, it's easy to force them or to find or acquire or develop new ones, which takes time, effort, and resources. And finally, at the very top, the most important level we have is called the TTPs, also known as tactics, techniques, and procedures. This is the crown jewel of defense. When you detect and disrupt TTPs, you are no longer targeting what the attackers uses. You are targeting how they behave or how they operate, and that's powerful. Because if an attacker is forced to change their behavior, their existing knowledge becomes less useful, their operations slow down significantly, and the cost of the attack increases dramatically. So in some cases, they may even abandon the attack altogether. So what does this mean for us? It means that effective defense is not about relying on just one layer. You need a layered approach. So using IOCs, things like indicators of compromise for quick wins, behavior detection for deeper visibility, and TTP analysis for long-term resilience. That gives us a more layered and much more robust defense. At the same time, we must also recognize that attackers often have significant financial and technological resources, some of which companies don't have. So the question becomes, how do we use that against them? So the answer is simple. We make attacks more expensive, more time-consuming, and less predictable. And this is exactly where frameworks like MITRE and models like the pyramid of pain come together to help us design smarter and more strategic defenses. So in the next part, we'll start connecting these ideas directly to how attack helps us map and detect adversary behaviors in real practice. So now, before MITRE was introduced, the cyber security landscape looked quite different. There was no single unified and publicly accessible repository that documented how attackers actually behave in the real world. Much of the knowledge about attacker behavior was held by some elite securities teams and sometimes the national intelligence organizations, like the NSC in the US. But here's the challenge. These groups often focus on forensic historical evidence, things like malware code or indicators that prove that an attacker had already been inside the system. And because this information was tied to sensitive intelligence resources and methods, it couldn't be easily shared. So consequently, the broader cybersecurity community like us had limited access to actionable knowledge about how attackers behave. So to address this gap, earlier models were developed, most notably the cyber kill chain that you see on the screen, which was introduced by Lockheed Martin in 2011, I think. So the kill chain breaks an attack down into a sequence of stages. So it shows you how the attacks move from the reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation of payload, command and control that allows the attacker to communicate back to the compromised systems, as well as action on objectives. So this model was a major step forward because it allowed us to understand the progression of an attack and also position defenses at different stages to interrupt the attack lifecycle. However, this kill chain also has its own limitations. First, it's linear and it's also high level, meaning it doesn't fully capture the complexity and variability of modern attacks. Real world attacks don't always follow a neat step-by-step path, They adapt, they repeat steps, and sometimes they use multiple techniques simultaneously. So this is where the MITRE attack also becomes very useful. The MITRE attack didn't just outline the stages of an attack, they even went deeper. They studied the real adversary behavior in detail and built a framework that captures all the specific techniques that the attackers use, the different ways that these techniques can be executed, and also how these behaviors differ across different systems. And more importantly, the framework made this knowledge an open source and accessible to everyone. You will see that as I take you through the MITRE, you do also have access to this. So nowadays, the framework has become a globally recognized, community-driven framework. It's used by both public and private sectors. It actually serves as a central trusted repository for all attack behavior, helping us, cybersecurity firms and organizations focus on the real threats, that matter most. So in summary, the kill chain helped us to understand the stages of an attack, but the MITRE attack helps us understand the behavior within those stages. And that deeper level of understanding is what enables more effective, more cybersecurity defenses. So this slide shows the types of traditional security assessments. You might be familiar with some of them, things like penetration test, which is a simulated cyber attack against a computer system, vulnerability assessments, vulnerability scanning, red team exercises, as well as blue and purple team exercises. I provided some brief descriptions of these traditional security assessments, but I'm not going to dwell much on them because the focus is not on traditional security systems, but on more modern techniques, also known as adversary-inspired testing. So when we talk about adversary-inspired testing, we need to take a picture of, as organizations mature, so their security practices become also clear, and in that they don't rely only on traditional methods like pen tests, red team exercises, as I've shown, because those are not enough. While these approaches are available, they often don't give us the full picture of how well our defenses perform against real world threats. So what are the alternatives? We can start by integrating what is called cyber threat intelligence, also known as CTI. What we mean by that, we need to identify which attackers are more relevant to your organization, what are their goals, and most importantly, how they actually behave. So adversary-inspired testing takes this intelligence and applies it directly to your environment. So adversary-inspired testing takes a cyber threat intelligence into action. So instead of just trying to break in, we mimic the real behavior of attackers. We mimic their tactics, their techniques, as well as their procedures in order to evaluate whether our defenses can detect and respond effectively. So this approach shifts the focus to no longer just asking, can we hack, can we be hacked? But instead, we need to ask ourselves, can we detect and stop how attackers behave once they're inside? So by doing this, organizations can test their defensive coverage against real world and attack patterns, and they can also identify which platforms and systems are actually at risk. And they can also evaluate whether their blue team controls are working as intended. So it also helps organizations think about the entire attack lifecycle, not just the initial breach, but also how attackers move laterally, how they collect data, how they exfiltrate data, and how they do measure impact in the organization. It also provides a common language or a taxonomy for attacker behavior, making it easier for blue teams to collaborate and improve over time. So this is, attackers work together and they collaborate. So this framework also helps us defenders to be able to collaborate and improve over time as much as attackers do. So now let's contrast this with traditional security assessments. Penetration testing, for instance, is often seen as the proactive approach, but in practice, it comes with several flaws or limitations. First, pen tests are time boxed, meaning like they've got a start and finish date. Usually it's like five days or 3 days. They happen over a fixed period, which may not reflect how real attackers operate. Attackers don't have a time box period. When they attack a network, they can do so over time or over months. Secondly, pen tests are heavily dependent on the scoping phase. So if something is out of scope, it's simply not tested, even if it represents a real risk. And thirdly, pen tests tend to focus heavily on exploitation, finding and abusing vulnerabilities, but they often neglect other critical stages of an attack, such as data collection, exfiltration, and long-term persistence. Another issue is that these assessments can sometimes create a toxic dynamic between teams. So the success of the offensive team is often seen as a failure of a defensive team. We end up pointing fingers at each other. When you reveal findings, the defensive team become defensive, as if we're trying to highlight flaws, and sometimes this leads to defensive behavior, blame shifting, and even the implementation of unrealistic security controls just to pass the test. So in some cases, organizations prepare in advance for assessments, which results in artificially strong defenses that do not even reflect their everyday security posture. So there are some also operational risk. Heavy scanning and enumeration can also cause system disruptions when you do vulnerability assessment or vulnerability scans. And many engagements stop once initial access is achieved, ignoring what happens next. So most pen tests are goal-oriented. Once they achieve a specific goal, the test is done. Ultimately, these traditional assessments often fail to represent the real-world threats, especially when it comes to insider threats or long-term attacker presence, and sometimes they don't show us the full attack lifecycle visibility. So the key takeaway there is that there's a clear need for a more mature, holistic approach to security assessments. One that evaluates defenses across the entire attack lifecycle, one that focuses on real adversary behavior, and one that encourages collaboration rather than competition between teams. And that's exactly what adversary-inspired testing is all about. It's also supported by frameworks like the MITRE, and also it also includes continuous intelligence-driven defense, which is quite nice. So on this slide, I show a definition of what exactly is adversary emulation. So we can build on that and introduce a new concept called adversary emulation, also often referred to as AE. So when we think about advanced threat actors like ATT&CK, it's important to understand that they don't just randomly exploit systems. They are so strategic. They spend time planning, they study their targets, and they also understand the organizations that they're targeting. In other words, they look at security holistically, how they can bypass the defenses, what detection mechanisms are in place, and how will those organizations respond. So if the attackers are thinking this way, the question becomes, how do we, as the defenders, assess our defenses against that level of sophistication? So this is where adversary emulation comes in. So adversary emulation is the type of red team or blue team engagement that uses real-world attacker behaviors, specifically their tactics or TTPs, to target an organization's security. But there's also a key difference here. Unlike the traditional red team, which is often goal-orientated, adversary emulation is behavior-orientated. It's not just about whether you can break into a system, it's about whether the organization can detect and respond to the attackers, and also to the attacker's behavior throughout the attack lifecycle. Another critical aspect of AE is collaboration. It aims to reduce the gap between red teams and blue teams, thereby encouraging communication and shared learning. In many cases, this becomes a purple team exercise where both sides work together to improve the overall security. Now, one of the challenges in this era is terminology, as you can see on the screen, as emulation and simulations, which is often used interchangeably, but they're not the same. So emulation means copying something that is real. In this case, it's mimicking the behavior of an actual known threat actor using real intelligence. On the other hand, simulation is more artificial. It creates a scenario that resembles an attack, but is not necessarily tied to a real adversary. So I will show you the difference between emulation and simulation once we get to the practical side of things, where I show you the MITRE attack framework itself. So experts like Josh Oakes have noted that adversary emulation can be either blind or non-blind. So if it's a blind, it's like a traditional red team exercise where the blue team is unaware. If it's non-blind, it's when a purple team, it's like an purple team's approach where the blue team is fully involved and aware. So that's what truly sets adversary emulation apart in terms of how success is measured. So let's now bring everything together and talk about the importance and practical application of AE. First, it's important to understand that AE builds on existing approaches like red teaming and purple teaming. Depending on the organization's objectives, these engagements can be announced where the defenders are aware and collaborate, similar what you see in a purple team exercise. And it can also be unannounced, where the defenders are tested in a realistic blind scenario, is what happens when we do a red team exercise. But irrespective of the approach, one thing remains constant here is that AE is always driven by a detailed plan that is based on a real known threat. Now you might ask, why do we need AE when we already have penetration testing and red teaming? So there are various reasons for that. One is that not all attackers behave the same way, and many traditional assessments do not reflect real-world adversary behavior. And secondly, most traditional approaches focus on identifying technical weaknesses such as vulnerabilities classified under the Common Weakness and Enumeration, or CWE, whereas AE focuses on TTPs or how attackers actually operate. And also AE provides a holistic view of the organization's readiness. It evaluates not just systems, but also people, processes, and technology. So another key advantage is that AE bridges the gap between red and blue teams, as I've mentioned, and also encourages collaborations, leads to a stronger detection capability and continuous learning, So to make this more concrete, you need to consider a real-world example where a generic research firm, which was once faced with a persistent attacks from an advanced threat actor, APT&CK, which was targeting some sensitive genetic data. So instead of relying only on penetration testing, their approach shifted to identifying the specific behavior that was targeting that industry, or threat actors that were targeting their industry. They started emulating their real-world TPTs, and then they started validating whether the organization could detect and respond. What they found was critical, that even if vulnerabilities were patched, the core threat that those specific attackers would still remain unaddressed without AE. So this highlights a key lesson. Fixing vulnerabilities is not enough if you are not defending against how your attackers actually behave. So if your organization already has security tools in place, AE the MITRE check frameworks. Hello?
Sorry, you just broke up there for a minute. I was just checking if you're still there. Please carry on. You're breaking up.
Can you still hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes.
But can you see the screen? I'm sure the screen is showing what, not showing.
Yeah, you can see it's got many, many different little squares inside the big one.
Now let me stop sharing and start sharing again.
Please, thank you.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay.
It's all
All right.
good.
Okay, so
We're
now
just
let's,
on the introductory one, MITRE ATT&CK framework, the opening slide.
yeah, it's not the opening slide. It's actually the slide after this one. So we're
Oh,
not
okay.
gonna, yeah, we're now gonna dive deep into the MITRE ATT&CK framework itself.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So now let's move on to the more recognizable components of the MITRE ATT&CK framework before I log into the MITRE ATT&CK framework itself. So to understand it properly, let's start with a simple concept. So in computer science, we've got what you know as a matrix, which is a two-dimensional table made up of rows and columns used to organize and represent data. You'll find matrices used in many areas such as maths, machine learning, and even data analysis. The idea is simple. It's a structure complex information in a way that makes it easier to visualize and navigate and also analyze. So now applying this into cybersecurity, the attack matrix is the visual representation of adversary behavior. So it organizes the tactics at the top, the blue sides, the blue part there that you see there, that is the top, these are the tactics also known as the goals. So for instance, reconnaissance, resource development and techniques, initial access, those are techniques. Those are tactics. Underneath them, you've got techniques. So reconnaissance has got 10 techniques underneath. Resource development as a tactic has got 8 techniques underneath it. Initial access as a tactic has got 9 techniques underneath it. The techniques also have got sub-techniques. But the techniques essentially are how one achieves the goals which are the tactics. So the tactics are the what, and the techniques are the how. So instead of reading through pages of documentation, you can look at matrix and understand and quickly understand what the attackers are trying to do and how they might do it. So this makes the matrix a powerful navigation tool for us as cybersecurity professionals. It allows us to map out the entire life cycle. It allows us to identify which techniques are relevant to any organization. And more importantly, it allows us to stop gaps in the defenses, to spot gaps in our defenses. For example, if you realize that you've got a strong detection for initial access, but very little visibility into lateral movement, the matrix will help you pinpoint exactly where your weaknesses are. So that's why the attack matrix is not just a reference, it's a decision-making tool. It helps organizations prioritize their security efforts, focusing on techniques that matter most to them. So when you first look at the attack matrix, it can feel overwhelming, but there's a lot of information, dozens of techniques, hundreds of techniques, and multiple sub-techniques across different environments. For beginners, it may look like a wall of complexity. But once you start understand how adversary life cycle flows across the matrix, it starts to make sense, and then you begin to see patterns like how attackers move from one tactic to another, how techniques are connected, and where detection opportunities also exist. So with time, the matrix becomes somewhat incredibly valuable. It becomes a tool where the exact information you need is right at your fingerprints. So as we move forward, we'll start breaking down the matrix step by step so that you can learn how to read it, interpret it, and more importantly, how to use it to strengthen your defenses. Okay, so the MITRE attack framework has categorized their knowledge base into 4 domains. But the most important ones are the enterprise, mobile, and ICS, because the pre-attack is the domain that happens prior to the attack. So each of these domains, includes all their own set of tactics and techniques. All of these are tailored to the specific environment. So at the same time, some techniques may appear across multiple domains because attackers often reuse similar behaviors in different contexts. So within each domain, the attack framework also defines the platforms. These are the actual systems or technologies where the attacks occur, things like your operating systems, cloud services, applications. So before we dive deep into each domain, it's also important to mention the pre-attack. So the pre-attack focuses on what happens before an attacker even gains access to a network, as I've mentioned. This includes activities like reconnaissance, information gathering, and so forth. So what makes pre-attack unique is that it's not tied to specific technology domain like the others. Instead, it models attacker behavior across all environments as they prepare for an attack. So the most important one is the enterprise matrix, which is the most widely used. This domain focuses on traditional IT environments like your corporate network, servers, applications, as well as your cloud infrastructure. It's very flexible. It allows organizations to model threats specific to their environment. So within the enterprise domain, you've also got several key platforms like broken down to operating systems, Windows, Linux, Mac OS, name them. Also broken down by cloud environments, whether it's Azure, AWS, Office 365, Google Workspace, and so forth. And also broken down per container, whether it's using Kubernetes or Docker containers. For example, if your organization relies heavily on cloud services, you can use the enterprise matrix to focus specifically on cloud-related attacks and also strengthen your defense there. And you also got the mobile matrix, which focuses on attacks targeting smartphones, tablets, and other mobile devices. This domain helps us understand how attackers compromise mobile environments using techniques such as disguising malware as legitimate applications, encrypting communications to avoid detection, or using rootkits to hide malicious activities. So the main platforms mostly you find on the MITRE framework is the Android and the iOS. So each has its own attack surface. For instance, Android may be targeted through vulnerabilities in apps or system components, whereas iOS attacks may involve techniques like jailbreaking, to gain deeper access. So using this matrix, organizations can implement controls such as mobile device management, vetting of applications before they use them on the network, and also some monitoring there. And lastly, we've got the ICS domain, also known. ICS stands for Industrial Control Systems. These are the systems that are used in manufacturing, water treatment plants, also known as SCADAs, operational technology. This physical domain is practically critical because it deals with systems that control physical processes like power generation, as I've mentioned, water treatment, and other forms of critical infrastructure. So ICS environments are unique because they combine IT and OT, and disruptions here can have real-world consequences. Imagine if a water treatment plant gets attacked by attackers, it can lead to huge devastation or even death of citizens. So the ICS matrix self-organization understand how attackers might gain initial access through vulnerabilities or social engineering, how attackers might move within these industrial networks, and how they can potentially disrupt or manipulate these physical processes. Because of the high stakes involved in ICS, security in this domain is extremely important. I cannot emphasize the importance of the ICS systems. Okay, so now we can move to the MITRE framework itself. Let me close the slides so that I can be able to go to my browser. So on your browser, you can just type MITRE. It's usually hosted on the GitHub platform. Okay, here it is. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So this is the MITRE framework. Look at it as the entire knowledge base, as I've just mentioned. So here on the matrices, you will see the enterprise, mobile, and ICS, as I've presented in my previous slides. You also got your tactics, also broken down per enterprise, mobile, and ICS, your techniques as well, defenses. Your CTI stands for threat intelligence, cyber threat intelligence. This is where you find the groups. So at least all the threat actors, as they are known, even the most famous ATT&CK is here. It provides you with their name, their IDs, associated groups, as well as the descriptions. And there's a wealth of information here. You can also search what type of industry vectors or industry verticals certain actors often try to target. For instance, ATT&CK is known for attacking financial industries. So look at the MITRE framework as the entire knowledge base. However, for you to be able to effectively use the MITRE framework, you've got what is called the navigation layer. So you can just search for MITRE Navigator from Google. Yes, it's also hosted on GitHub. So this is where the rubber hits the road, right? So for you to be able to, for instance, understand how threat actors operate, this is where you need to start. So you'll go to the MITRE Navigator, you go to create a new empty layer. It will give you an option for enterprise, mobile, and ICS. We'll go for the enterprise one because that's the most commonly used. Okay, so this is your navigation layer. I'll take you through all the controls. So at the top there, you've got selection controls, you've got layer controls, you've got technique controls. When it comes to selection controls, the first one is the search. So for the search, you can search for anything here. It's just use as a search functionality. The next one is the deselect. Once you've selected certain techniques, you can be able to deselect them here. How the selection behavior works. You can select techniques across tactics. For instance, some techniques exist across tactics. So you might find that the one that I've highlighted, acquire infrastructure, might exist in other tactics as well. So this option allows you to, so that if you select one technique, it can also select others that exist in different other tactics. This one gives an option to select techniques with parents. For instance, if you look at these double vertical lines mean that there's other sub-techniques within that. So active scanning as a technique has got sub-techniques called scanning, IP block, vulnerability scanning. So this selection allows you that if you select the parent one, it also allows you to select the children. And this one also allows you to select only visible techniques because there's a way that you can also hide certain techniques. So if you select this option, it allows you to be able to select other techniques as well. Now let's move to layer controls. Layer controls have to do with the actual layer itself. So the first one is about layer settings, and here is about export. So you can export the actual layer once you've created your plan, either to a JSON file or a spreadsheet, or even take an image of it in SVG. These are filters. For instance, if you want to see only tactics related to Windows platforms, you can deselect the others. Or if you deselect Windows, you can see the changes already happen here because Windows is the primary platform. So this will only show all the techniques related to those that you've highlighted. For instance, these I've left the ones that are only related to the cloud platform, like containers, infrastructure as a service, and software as a service. Let me select all of them. Okay. And the next one allows you to sort all the techniques in whether ascending or descending in terms of alphabetic. And here, this is where you set up your color. I'll show you how this is used. And this is how to disable some of the techniques if you don't want them to appear. And then we move to the last one called technique controls. So here you can toggle between techniques. This one allows you to toggle between, as you can see, this one is highlighted. When I click this one, it becomes disabled. So this is just a toggle one. This one is for setting up a background color. So if you've selected the technique, I can give it a color here. And here is scoring. I'll show you how the scoring works in a short while. And the next one is about comment. You can assign comments on each and every technique. Comments also act as metadata. This one is a link, and also we've got a one for metadata as well. For metadata, we can add any data related to any specific technique. Okay, so let's start to emulate techniques used by a well-known threat actor like ATT&CK. I like using ATT&CK. Okay, so for you to be able to do that, you go to selection controls, you go to search, you type ATT&CK. It will start listing all the techniques that are commonly used by ATT&CK. As you can see, there's 7 of them. You can select all of them like this, as I've signed. So now, what this tells us is that, okay, let me color them so that you can be able to see them. Let me give them a color of red. So these are all the techniques commonly used by ATT&CK. Do this. So for instance, ATT&CK, what they do, they normally conduct active scanning when they do their reconnaissance. They normally scan IP blocks, vulnerability scanning, wet list scanning, and they also gather victims' identity information, acquire. So this will give you an example of what techniques that ATT&CK uses. How is this useful to us? If you want to emulate what ATT&CK attacks behavior is, you can be able to start doing your adversary emulation based on the techniques that are highlighted here in red. However, in some cases, you might want to emulate more than one threat actor. For instance, you might want to emulate ATT&CK and APT38, which are the most prominent ones. How do you do that? So you have to create another layer. I'll show you just now. So for instance, this one is called APT29. We can name it APT29 as a layer. So layer name here, let's name it APT29. So you see APT29 starting to appear as the layer now of this. And then we create another one as a new tab, create a new tab, enterprise, search, APT38. It will list all the techniques that are done by APT38. And be able to select them. And you can be able to give them a different background color. However, if you have to combine these APTs and have the third layer that combines threat tactics from APT29 and APT38, that's where your coloring, your gradient coloring comes into play. Okay, so for that, let me start afresh. Okay, let's create a layer called APT29. Let's select all the tactics used by APT29. They have been selected. Under techniques, under color setup, give this 3. I set the preset to red and green. When you start playing around with colors, colors can mean different things to different people. So in this case, I've used a preset of red to green. In my case, red will mean that the tactic was successful. Green will mean that the tactic was unsuccessful. Red, because it's a red team, red is for danger, meaning that the tactic, the compromise was successful. Anything beyond that, it means it was partially successful. So that's why we set up the color grading here. So now that I've selected all the tactics used by APT21 and created my grading, I can start scoring them. I can give them a base score of 1, for instance, where 1 means the attacks are successful. Okay, and let's name this layer APT29. Cool. And let's create another one. We're going to model here the attacks based on APT38, which is another. We can select any threat group. And then we select all the attack techniques used by APT39. We define the color setup. The color setup must be the same as the other one. Presets, red to green. Then we give it a score, a base score also of 1. And then we name it APT38. Cool. And then we define another one which combines the threat techniques for threat actor APT29 as well as APT38. So if you want to do an adversary emulation that will emulate the behavior of APT29 and the behavior of APT38. So you create a new layer, enterprise layer. Oh no, let me see. There's an option to select from a existing. Okay. So you create layer from other layers. That's where it is. You will see that it has given A, B, highlighted A, B. And if you go up to the screen here, you can see also A, B. So this allows you to do an expression I'll show you just now. So you're going to give this layer, it's an enterprise attack layer. We give it the latest version. I think latest version is enterprise layer version, latest version. And then you add APT29 and APT38. You use common expression A plus B. Okay, and ready to allow it to assign it to any of them. You can choose APT29 or AP29. Remember, we've given all of them the same grade and score. All the other leaders, you can leave them as they are. So what you have now is a new layer that combines APT29 and APT38. Where you see colors that are yellow, it means that this technique is used by both APT29 and APT38. That's why it has given it a different color coding as this one. So what you have here, you can You can export it into an Excel spreadsheet. Okay, spreadsheet has been created. Here's the spreadsheet. And then you can give this to your red team and tell them, guys, let's say you work for a bank. You say, guys, we work for a financial institution, and when our most threat actors that are likely to target us are APT-29 and APT-38. These are the techniques that they commonly used. Please conduct a red team exercise using these tactics. So then all you do is give them this plan. However, there's more you can do with the MITRE framework, which is some of which may be beyond the scope of this lecture. But basically, this is how the attack is the MITRE framework is used. I'll open the floor to questions. Any questions, guys?
Dr. Mayisela, thank you for an excellent lecture. The students are buzzing. Yeah, I think we've got about 100 questions. Let's try and get through a few, if you don't mind. If you're happy to just give me another 10 minutes, I would appreciate it to ask you some of the questions. Thank you. Let me start with, so we'd like to get through quite a few, if you'll just perhaps just try and keep your answers as brief as possible. So some of the students have asked, but don't the attackers also make use of these same frameworks?
The question is, why would the attackers use the same frameworks? Because remember, the frameworks document what the attackers are already doing. So for them to look at that, they'll be reading more like, their specifications. So I've even seen a use case where attackers will read the same framework, unless if they want to understand what other threat actors are doing. Yes, they would do that. But and also emulate what other threat actors are doing. Yes, that's the only use case I would understand. And just to mention another thing, this information that's on the MITRE framework, it's what we call cyber threat intelligence. It's not the only information available to us. Some organizations don't even use the MITRE framework. They use the information, the cyber threat intelligence that they've gathered from other sources as well. But the MITRE framework has much more knowledge base compared to most of the threat intelligence we see out there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How does South Africa conduct threat actor attribution and detection? Do agencies employ proactive techniques such as honeypots, threat intel platforms, and network telemetry, or are responses largely reactive following an incident? Presume when we talk about agencies, the students referring to the public sector.
That's a very good question. So most South African companies rely on global threat intelligence. It's not only limited to South Africa, it's global, it's across the borders. That's where they capture information and attempts. And also some of the threat intelligence, in actual fact, I would say 70%, if not 80% of threat intelligence come from vendors. So you find like vendors like Darktrace, Fortinet, and all of those, they have their own threat intelligence, which they share with other vendors, thereby creating a large volume of a large knowledge base of threat intelligence that any organization can tap into. We ourselves, remember last year we did a presentation. I brought my guys from IGAT SA. We also have a threat intelligence center that contributes about 85% to the entire global threat intelligence ecosystem. So there's a lot of threat intelligence that we gather us as well, even more over and above what the MITRE framework can contribute.
That's really pretty incredible information. Thank you. Next question. Why is focusing on attacker behavior, TTPs, more effective than focusing only on indicators of compromise like IPs or file hashes?
That's because I did mention this on my lecture. That's because things like IOCs and IPs, they change over time. Remember, hackers can rotate IP addresses in one day when they can have about 90 IP addresses targeting one system, but that happens by one actor. It's easy for hackers to rotate IP addresses, but it's not easy for them to change their behavior. So it's more effective to attack to target the behavior rather than things like IP addresses and indicators of compromise. You cause more pain if you target their behaviors, TTPs, rather than things like hashes, IPs, like I've shown in that pyramid of pain.
How often should a company do pen tests?
Well, pen tests, as I've mentioned, while we do them as also as organizations, like we do provide pen tests to our customers, they are not really effective because remember they are a point in time assessment, and they largely depend on the scope. If something is not in the scope, it means it was not addressed. So how often it depends. There's some regulations like the PCI DSS that states that you must do pen test at least once every 2 years. Some organizations are driven by their regulatory requirements to say, for us to meet these regulatory requirements, we need to do pen test twice a month. There's no actual standard or to say how many times you must do it. But to be reasonable, I think twice a year it might be adequate.
Yeah, and it's expensive, right?
Yes, and it's also expensive.
And disruptive. Okay, so I've got a question here from Fungai Chikariwa. Given the rise of zero-day exploits, AI-driven attack tools, and the reality that prevention alone will fail, how should South African organizations shift their cybersecurity strategy from protection to resilience? And what specific controls or practices create enough friction to make attackers move on to easier targets?
I hear two questions there.
Yeah. So the first one would be, how should South African organizations shift their cybersecurity strategy from protection to resilience? And the second would be, what specific controls or practices create enough friction to make attackers move on to easier targets?
Okay, that's a very, very good question. So let's start with the strategy one. So for us to move from being reactive to be more resilient, we need to adopt the zero trust strategy, where we trust nothing, where we verify all. And remember, zero trust even monitors or does not trust people who've got legitimate access to their company resources, thereby limiting the dangers around insider threat as well. And by so doing, it's easier for you because resilience is about, recovering from a breach. So when it comes to resilience, when it comes to resilience, you need to make sure that your data backups are up to scratch, up to the latest. Because what you've seen with most of the ransomware attacks, they can't eradicate the ransomware itself. They have to, re-image the systems again from backups. But if they don't have backups with recent data, it means they're not resilient. They're unable to recover effectively from attack. So things like that are basic as doing backups, having a robust disaster recovery strategy and a proper business continuity plan have become very, very important nowadays. And also, attackers have become sophisticated now. They use AI. For instance, there are more AI-powered attacks that we see these days. So we're coming to we've reached a stage where we need AI to defend against AI. So as we move our defenses to become more resilient, we need to adopt AI as well as one of our resilience strategy.
Thank you. Doctor, I'm going to just give you a couple of the compliments. You saw actually hundreds of questions. One, a lot of the students said this is really informative. They're really loving this lecture, loving the way that you're presenting the lecture. Another says, Doctor, you're very technical. I like these kind of lectures. Another says, thank you for today's lecture. I can't wait to do more MITRE ATT&CK labs. So you really hit the sweet spot here with this one. And, as obviously as we knew you would, So I know you're a busy guy. So not only running your company, but also lecturing at the University of the Witwatersrand. Very busy. Thank you for your commitment to SANKS and your ongoing support of this project, and for taking the students on a really great learning journey today.
No, I
Thank
should
you.
I should commend you, Noel. What you're doing is very phenomenal. There's a huge shortage of cybersecurity professionals. Things like initiatives like the ones you've put together, we would say it goes a long way to alleviating this skill shortage and death of highly skilled cybersecurity professionals. We need a lot of them. I hope from the students we've lectured today, we're gonna have really good cybersecurity professionals that are going to see things differently from how we see them.
Thank you.
You're
Thank
doing
you,
a great
Doctor.
job.
I
Thank
think
you.
that's inspiring to the students, and you clocked quite a huge audience of like 1,600 people in teams. So yeah, thank you very much, Simpiwe, and have a
Thank you.
wonderful evening.